It technically is true to say that the New Orleans Saints had an up and down year this year. The unfortunate thing is for the New Orleans Saints that there really was only one up and a whole lot of down. Starting the season off 2-0 after wins against the Carolina Panthers and the Dallas Cowboys, the Saints began the season outscoring their opponents 91-29. They were led by an efficient passing game, a takeaway-happy defense, and an offensive line that at one point I called the best in the entire NFL. After that, they had two heartbreaking losses, one by 3 points against Philly, the next by 2 points against the Atlanta Falcons. Against Philly, the Saints took a 3-0 lead into the fourth quarter. They gave up 15 points, including a game-winning Saquon Barkley touchdown with just over a minute remaining in the ballgame. And against the Falcons, the Saints would take a 1-point lead off an Alvin Kamara touchdown with a minute left in the fourth quarter, just to lose off a 58-yard field goal off the foot of Younghoe Koo. It was downhill at 100 miles an hour for the Saints after that first Falcons game. They would go on to lose 12 of their last 15 games. They ended up losing Derek Carr, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed to season-ending injuries, and they looked like a talentless offense for around 3/4 of the season. So, how do we fix the New Orleans Saints? The first question is who is actually going to be the head coach of this team next year. After 2.5 years of pretty average play and probably below average coaching under Dennis Allen, the New Orleans Saints moved on and had interim head coach and special teams coordinator Darren Rizzi in his place. While I'm sure a new message was welcomed by the players of the Saints, they still did not perform very well. I could totally see the Saints going after a coach that could make the most out of this defense because there's a good chance that this offense is, again, like 2024, not very good. Defensively, they weren't great last year, and we'll get into that more, but offensively, they were even worse. And a majority of the reason this team looked talentless on offense is because they're aging. To begin with, they don't have a lot of talent, and they're just not very good. While Derek Carr had a totally fine season last year up until he got injured, he still lacks that X factor that puts him into the top 10 to 15 quarterbacks of the NFL, where you really can sit there and look at him and say that he's the quarterback of the future, or at least he's the quarterback of the present. I don't think Derek Carr presents anything that really confirms you of that on either of those statements. In terms of the head coach question, I think someone like the Brian Floreses or the Steve Spagnuolos or Lou Anarumos of the world would probably be the best match in terms of A, getting the most out of a high-performing defense and three guys who have called high-performing defenses in their career, and B, I think these guys would provide a bit more of a leadership quality than we've seen out of Dennis Allen and since Sean Payton left the New Orleans Saints. And that leads to the next question of who is actually going to be playing quarterback for this team next season. And like I said, yes, Derek Carr played fine last year and is a $51 million cap hit in 2025. So while it does seem like you kind of have to play him because there's nobody that's going to trade for that contract, and if you cut Derek Carr, it's going to leave around $30 million of dead cap money. Your only other option is Spencer Rattler. And while he did provide an ability to be a low-level starter and possible high-level backup in this league, neither Derek Carr or Spencer Rattler provided a long-term option at the quarterback position. Something I mentioned about the Seahawks in my How to Fix the Seattle Seahawks video is that patience is something that should be completely exercised and taken in this offseason in 2025. And that same exact thing could be said about the New Orleans Saints. I, as well as probably you watching this, and probably any other NFL fan or New Orleans Saints fan, I don't think we expect the Saints to be contending for an NFC South championship, much less an NFL championship in 2025. So why delay a rebuild any longer? We've been at this point with the New Orleans Saints for a long time now, where they're just middling. And since Drew Brees left and since Sean Payton left, which seems like a long time, but it's really only 3 or 4 years, this team hasn't blown it up yet. They immediately went for Derek Carr. And while he provided a stopgap at the position, he's not a long-term answer. Spencer Rattler probably is not a long-term answer either. The problem is they, again, delayed this rebuild. And it's probably the right year to delay the rebuild because I don't think Cam Ward is a good option at quarterback for this team. And I think Shadir Sanders needs to go to an offense where he has a lot of talent around him. And that's not the New Orleans Saints. So, the answer to the QB question, I think you have to do everything in your power to not have Derek Carr be your quarterback next year. And you have to play Spencer Rattler, or you have to play another quarterback that you're replacing Derek Carr with that's a young option that just can increase value over this next year. And hope that you're picking high enough in the draft next year where you could go get Arch Manning from Texas. Because between this year and next year, I think every team's best option would be to wait to try to get Arch Manning and try to build up a better team going into the 2026 season. Now, if we continue the conversation about the offense, statistically, the only thing that you can say that this offense did well last year is that they did not allow a lot of sacks and they were above average at running the ball. Two things that directly can be attributed to the offensive line. Derek Carr and Spencer Rattler combined to be one okay quarterback, but nothing really spectacular or even above average. Alvin Kamara was easily the best player on this offense, the most productive, and the most talented player on this offense. He was the only player with over 550 yards from scrimmage with his 1493. They got very little production from anyone else. Rashid Shaheed was off to a very blazing start, but then he got injured. Chris Olave, I think we all understand how talented he is. He got injured. Taysom Hill, their every down player, got injured. It was really Alvin Kamara and Jawan Johnson that were there for a majority of this season. Turning the conversation back to the offensive line, this was the group that was the bright spot of this entire team. Anchored by their two tackles, first-round pick Taliesin Fuaga and third-year man Trevor Penning, they were at their best early in the year when they were fully healthy. And that's a very obvious statement, but it's as true as it is obvious. When they had Eric McCoy, when they had Cesar Ruiz, and they did have Lucas Patrick in there with those two tackles that I already mentioned, I called them the best offensive line in the NFL. I said that they did something for this team that no other offensive line did, and that is single-handedly put a team on their back. Alvin Kamara was going to have an incredible season regardless of if this offensive line was there, and while they were there, he played incredibly. The problem was Cesar Ruiz only played about 3/4 of the snaps this year, and Eric McCoy went down 1/4 of the way through the year. The whole interior of the offensive line saw 8 different guys shuffling through there at some point, and they struggled to showcase the same dominance that they had at the beginning of the season. Going to the defense, this was a team that was led by their secondary. In less than half the games, cornerback Alontae Taylor had a team-leading 3 interceptions. Safety Tyrann Mathieu had a typically really good season. In nickelback, Paulson Adebo was probably the most involved player and the most valuable player on this defense. He provided 4 sacks, 16 pass deflections, and 2 forced fumbles. Other than that, this defense was really not very good statistically. However, if they had one offensive playmaker on their team, other than Alvin Kamara, that could provide more of a spark offensively, I'm sure some of these statistics, just from how that naturally works, would look a little bit better for the Saints defense. We're going to skip through the free agency period because I really just don't think New Orleans can do anything. This is called How to Fix the New Orleans Saints. It's not called How to Play Magic Man and Turn a Dumpster Fire into the Niagara Falls. The Saints are already over the salary cap for next season by at least $60 million. And while people want to throw out the fact that they could cut Derek Carr, they could cut Cam Jordan, they could cut whoever they want, that's so much dead money that's just going to be on the books, whether those guys play or not. And as great of an option as it is, it doesn't solve anything. What are you going to get from cutting Derek Carr and saving $20 million? What are you going to get from cutting Cam Jordan and saving $7 to $10 million? You're not getting a lot. Like I said, this team is going to be over the salary cap by at least $60 million. This is one of the worst jobs that we've seen from a salary cap perspective in a very long time in the NFL. Terrible from the fact that they're $60 million over the cap, and also from the fact that this is a very untalented team to have that much money going around. You have to look at the draft, and you have to look at the fact that the Saints have the number 9 overall pick. And while last year's draft, They did get Fuaga, and they did get Kool-Aid McKinstry, two solid players. Those were the only two picks, really, that they made last year. Yes, they got Bub Means, they got Spencer Rattler, and they got some other okay rotational players in the draft. But when you look at previous years, the 2023 draft, while it might look somewhat salvageable because Brian Brzee had 7.5 sacks this year, but the selection of Isaiah Foskey, who in 2 years has played just over 100 snaps, the selection of Kendre Miller in the third round, who you got basically nothing out of him again this year, and Jake Haener looked absolutely terrible in his one start for the Saints this year. The 2023 draft is looking like it's going to be a nightmare haunting this front office for the next few seasons, if they're even there for the next few seasons. 2025, they have a total of 8 selections, which could, of course, increase or decrease with offseason or draft day trades. With the number 9 selection, the Saints will probably have their pick of cornerback Will Johnson from Michigan, edge player Abdul Carter from Penn State, wide receiver Teteroa McMillan from Arizona, Ashton Jeanty, Will Campbell, Tyler Warren, Colson Loveland, and many other players that I think could massively improve this roster from a pure talent perspective. Another thing I said in my Seahawks video was that I think drafting one of either Tyler Warren or Colson Loveland would be an incredible pick for a lot of reasons, and I think the same could be said for the Saints. For the Saints' perspective, tight end is going to be a position of need, especially with Jawan Johnson leaving in free agency and Taysom Hill having a season-ending injury this year. The position needs to be addressed, and even if both of those guys were on the team next year, the position is a very big weakness on this roster. And yes, they can patch it together by doing all these weird trick plays, by having Taysom Hill being at quarterback or being at running back or whatever they want to do. They at some point need to do something about modernizing this offense, because they've just kind of patched it together and played BS football on offense for the last 3 years. And getting a tight end that can stabilize the position, that can be an easy medium to short route target for this team, can be an incredible option offensively going forward. I've seen a lot of people say that offensive line needs to be targeted by the New Orleans Saints in the draft, and I just really don't think that makes a lot of sense. Like I said, you have 2 tackles already, and your interior offensive line, when they're healthy, is one of the best in the NFL. They rival the Chiefs in terms of talent, and they rival the Chiefs in terms of production on that interior. If it's not either Loveland or Warren at the tight end position, it needs to be somebody in the front 7 on the defense, or it needs to be another playmaker. I don't even care if it's Ashton Jeanty, and you have Ashton Jeanty and Alvin Kamara going into next season, because eventually Alvin Kamara is not going to be this 1,400, 1,300 yards from scrimmage player anymore. He's just not. He's getting up there in age, and you also don't want to pay him that much money either. You get Ashton Jeanty in there instead, you pay him a lot less money, and you get probably similar production running behind that offensive line. All in all, I think a lot of Saints fans are probably going to be displeased with what I'm saying, and they're going to think I have no idea what I'm talking about, because I'm basically telling the Saints to be patient and almost do nothing this offseason other than draft really quality players. Again, the Saints can't do anything. And yes, you never want to be at a point where you feel like your ownership or front office group of your favorite team just doesn't care to make the team better, or that they're fine with being a bottom feeder. But as the saying goes, things have to get a lot worse before they get any better. And for a long time, really, when Drew Brees and Sean Payton were there, the New Orleans Saints had it pretty good. And for only a few years, they have to have some bad happening. And again, it has to get worse before it gets any better.